I'm sure you've all memorized the material and can recite it by heart. I'm going to open with a prayer. Let us pray. O God of unchangeable power and eternal light, look favorably on your whole church, that wonderful and sacred mystery. By the effectual working of your providence, carry out in tranquility the plan of salvation. Let the whole world see and know that things which were cast down are being raised up, and things which had grown old are being made new, and that all things are being brought to their perfection by him through whom all things were made, your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. As you looked at the material today, the history material from England and then from America, that prayer was used to open for the illumination part of the discussion. So you may have read that prayer, you may have seen that prayer in the materials, but can anyone tell me where that prayer comes from? Where do we use that prayer in worship? Yes, I see you, Curtis. Hang on a second.
I'm going to wait. I know.
The Book of Common Prayer?
Yeah, but that prayer comes in a particular place in a service that we do. I just wondered if anyone knew. I mean, you don't have to know. I just wondered if anybody did know. All right, Curtis, go ahead.
I know it's used in the Easter Vigil. I know it's used it's one of the possible collects for ordinations.
Well, now you're making me look.
It's the option for the last. It's one of the options for the last reading in the Vigil service. I think it's the last collect in the liturgy of the 9 in the liturgy of the Word. And I don't have my prayer book with me, so I'm guessing, Andy. But
yeah, if you choose to do that reading,
mm-hmm. But
yes.
I also know
it is a collect in the Vigil if you do it with that Zephaniah reading.
It's also in the Good Friday liturgy as part of the Solemn Collect, I believe.
Right, and that's where I most associate it. That's what I was thinking of. In the Solemn Collects on Good Friday, that is the final collect that is read. But I think it's it is a collect for the church, that we as the church hold up one another, and that things that are cast down are being raised up. That's our job as the church. Things that are old are being made new. That's our job as the church. Certainly with baptism, that's old being made new. And so it speaks volumes for what we're talking about today with the history. But before I get into the history, did anyone have any thoughts or comments on the introduction part? I think it's laid out really well. One of the things you need to remember, and I've told my other confirmation class this curriculum comes out of the Diocese of Alabama. That's where I used it the last 12 to 13 years, and I really like how they did it. And this was done, I believe, in 2007. So it has not been updated. And I'll tell you what, the diocesan office got tired of me calling them saying, when are you going to update it? When are you going to update it? So it'll say, it talks in an introduction, and it talked a little bit in history too about things like the civil rights movement, things like racism and gender equality. And then it talked about matters of sexuality being things we're in now. Well, we've actually dealt with a lot of those. So this curriculum hasn't caught up to the fact that we've passed a lot of these resolutions and have actually done something about the human sexuality thing. So don't let that throw you off. Just remember that this was written in 2007, and as there needs to be corrections made as we go along, I will make those, and I will send you materials that sort of rewrite those sections to make sense with what the church, to be in line with what the church thinks now. So that's sort of a disclaimer for the whole thing. But the first thing I want to point out is one of the things it says in that introduction when it talks about us as an Anglican church, that we are not a covenant church or a confessing church, in the sense that we don't subscribe to a particular covenant or a particular confession. We are a creedal church, which means that the creeds contain what we need as a succinct statement of faith of who we are. We are creedal, we are sacramental. You know, you can look at some other denominations and say they definitely hold to a confession, or they definitely hold to a covenant. You know, I think what comes to mind is maybe like the Augsburg Confession, something like that. And that's not good or bad or right or wrong or anything like that. It's just that's not what we have. Our unifying thing about us as Anglicans is the Book of Common Prayer. That's probably one of our biggest, well, okay, outside of the obvious of belief in Jesus Christ, but the Book of Common Prayer is kind of what ties us together. You saw mentioned in some of the materials there, other references, it references you to the preface of the Book of Common Prayer. Did anyone go back and read that?
Mm-hmm.
You did, good, and we might look at that tonight. In the English section, it sent you to the 39 articles, which you'll find in the historical documents section of our prayer book. And then in the American section, it also pointed you towards the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral.
Yeah.
Which is still a binding document today. That says, you know, there are really four things that hold us together as Anglicans in the whole Anglican communion. And the Book of Common Prayer being one of them, the historic episcopate, or bishops, being one of them. And so we talk a lot about the historic episcopate today. So let's, unless anyone has questions before we jump in, let's jump into England.
I have one question.
Okay.
Dean, this is Joe Ungashik.
I
was wondering how many others in the group were taking this for a grade like I am. In other words, in consideration of joining the church membership.
I think, well, some of the people here are actually in the last stages of finishing the first confirmation class I started. And now I think you may be the only one in this group so far that's considering confirmation, so that's good. But it's a refresher for everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if any of you decide that if you've been confirmed and you want to be reaffirmed, then you can do that as well.
And Joe, I'm still trying to deserve it.
You say with a great faith.
All right, so let's look at England. So when you ask the general public, how did the Church of England begin? I would say the comment you hear more than any other is because Henry wanted a divorce.
Yeah. That's what we were taught at the Catholic school.
Well, of course, that's what you were taught at the Catholic school. There could be no other church outside of Rome. So, you know, England did their own thing. We threw them out. And yes, Henry did seek a divorce, but historically speaking, that's not really what you can call the origins of the English church. That had a role in it for sure. But one thing we have to remember is that I think this our curriculum does a good job of explaining this. There was an English church that existed already at that time.
Right.
And one of the things you have to remember is back in the 1500s, and indeed before that, Rome may have been the the seat of Christianity, or what became the seat of Christianity. But to travel from Rome all the way out to the places where Christianity existed was not an easy thing or a convenient thing. So you're in England, and if someone, if you're doing something that Rome doesn't approve of, it's going to take a while for them to figure that out, right?
Yeah.
So someone's going to have to go visit and come back to Rome and report, well, those crazy English people are doing this. They aren't doing it this way. They're doing it this way. And Rome could say, well, that's wrong. You need to send someone over there and tell them they've got to stop doing it. So, however long that takes, someone comes over and says, don't do it. And so they quit doing it. And then they leave and they go back to doing it the way they were doing it before, right? So we have historically a lot of liturgies that were part of the English church. And as what you read tells you, it draws a lot from Celtic traditions. It draws a lot from monastic traditions, Benedictine traditions. And so England was sort of doing it their way anyway. And probably one of the greatest places you can look to see that is Salisbury, or Sarum, old Sarum now, but Salisbury, England was kind of a hotbed of creating these English liturgies that were used. And so they weren't even necessarily the same as what Rome was using, but it was still with priests, it was still with bishops, it was all of that. And a lot of it was in English. It wasn't even in Latin. Some of it was still in Latin for sure, but Latin was officially what you were supposed to do. So there was a precedent for something that already existed in England, right? And you have to remember too that in politics, oftentimes, especially in those days, and probably not as much anymore, but it could probably happen. A lot of these alliances were made through marriage, weren't they? So in other words, if the king marries the princess of another country, that in a way unites the countries, doesn't it? And you form these alliances. So Henry was stuck in a way in this, because remember, Henry's brother, who had become king after their father died, his brother died, making Henry VIII king. And I think Henry VIII was about, 15 when that happened? And his brother had no children with his wife. And so in a levirate marriage, Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon. And so he could raise children then that would have been technically children of his brother, if you look at it in the pure sense of levirate marriage. So Henry gets this wife that he didn't necessarily want. That's just the politics of it, right? And Henry wants an heir, and they had a daughter. And Henry was not very happy about that. They had a daughter named Mary. And Henry, once he finds the fancy of another woman, decides that his marriage was illegitimate. He says he said it was never consummated. Yet they have a daughter, but he says it was never consummated. And the thinking is that the Pope at the time, and I can't tell you who the Pope was at the time without looking it up, that the Pope probably would have allowed the annulment, and probably would have allowed Henry to divorce Catherine, and all would have been well, because the Pope liked Henry, because Henry was a great defender of the Catholic faith. And the Pope had actually given him that title, Defender of the Faith, for an apology he had written about the church. So enters Catherine of Aragon's, I can't remember now if he was a cousin or a brother, but it was Philip of Spain, the King of Spain. And he went to the Pope and said, if you allow this annulment, Rome is no friend of Spain. And so the Pope said, okay, I won't allow the annulment. He didn't want to lose Spain. And so thus that begins. And so what we get is Henry being outraged that the Pope won't listen to him. I think the idea for an English church was probably already there, and this just pushed it along. So Henry, through the acts of supremacy, goes through Parliament and creates the Church of England in 1534. And he takes his the chaplain of the new woman he's enamored with, Anne Boleyn, takes her family chaplain, Thomas Cranmer, and makes him Archbishop of Canterbury. And then Cranmer, as Archbishop, grants the divorce and marries Henry and Anne. And of course, he still doesn't get a son out of that marriage, but he gets something which for the Church of England is even better. He gets a daughter named Elizabeth. So Henry begins the acts of suppression, or does the acts of suppression, which form the Church of England. And so one way I like to look at it is if you take what the church, the way the church was in England on, let's say on Sunday, and then the acts of supremacy happen, and on Monday, you're the same church operating in basically the same way, except you don't answer to the Pope anymore, you now answer to the King. So the liturgies of the church, the things of the church, the way the church was structured really didn't change all that much from Roman Catholicism. They just had a new person in charge. And Henry, you can believe, took every bit of confidence in saying that he was the head of the church. And he called himself that, head of the church, the defender of the faith. So Henry sets that up. Thomas Cranmer gives us the first book of Common Prayer in 1549, which was done to unite all of England, all of the English church in common worship, so that all would be doing the same thing. And you weren't following the whims of this bishop or this person or that monk or whatever it was. You all had a set pattern for how you were going to do things, and he thought it would unite the church together, and in fact it did. But Henry at first was insistent that the only thing he would allow in English was the Lord's Prayer. The rest of the service was still to be in Latin. Even though they were the Church of England, he still wanted it in Latin. He still was defending that Catholic faith. And so we get the Lord's Prayer in English, and then you have to remember what's going on the continent at this point. They'd already had the Protestant I can't think of the word.
Reformation?
Reformation, thank you. They'd already had the Protestant Reformation. So that, Luther has already done his thing. That's going on. So that, of course, is influencing some of what's happening now in England. The English Reformation came a little bit later. And Cranmer certainly was influenced by Luther, very much so, and particularly in his writing of the Book of Common Prayer. And you'll see some similarities to what Luther did, to what Cranmer put in the prayer book there. So Cranmer puts together the first prayer book in 1549. He sends it out to his friends, including Martin Bucer, and Bucer tells him, hey, you need to revise this and do this. And so he does, and we get another edition of it in 1552. And at this point, Henry has died. We now have Edward, his son, who's all of 9 years old, as the head of the church, with a council of advisors, including the Archbishop. So in some cases, you'll see these prayer books of 1549 and 1552 called the prayer books of Edward VII. Then Edward dies. We think there probably would have been another revision to the prayer book in 1555 had Edward not died. But when Edward died, remember what happened? We had the whole who's going to be the monarch. And they tried this person and this person, this person, and we ended up with Mary. So when Mary takes the throne, she immediately returns the church back to Rome. So the English church goes away. Rome is back in England until 1558, is it?
Mhm.
When Mary dies and Elizabeth takes the throne, and Elizabeth restores the Church of England back to the way it was. And then we have these articles called the Elizabethan Settlement. And as you read in the material, it said that that really did more for the Anglican Church than Henry did in the first place, because that really solidified the church and how it would operate and how it would work. And then Elizabeth, and she changed her name. She is no longer the head of the church. She said, Jesus Christ is the head of the church. I'm simply the defender of the faith. So that change was made when she came into power. And so that's where we are there. Any thoughts or comments or questions or concerns or anecdotes or anything on the English history? It's pretty steeped with lots of crazy stuff.
This is Bud. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that when I've read this period of time, I believe that the Catholic Church had about 1/3 of all of the wealth that England possessed. And so there was a big movement, and that's one of the reasons that I've read, that England was glad to embrace this move. Does that make any sense?
It does make sense. Yeah, they were very low on money. But remember, one of the things Henry did to refill the treasury is once the Church of England had been established, Henry went through a lot of the monasteries and churches in England and stripped them bare.
Just pillaged them. And
Yeah, and took everything. Yeah.
And one of he had a leader a man that did it. And of course, all of his people who were, I don't know what they called them, you would call them senators now or something like that. They all approved of this because it brought wealth back to the
Right. It gave him money. Yeah. Henry wanted to be the center of attention, and he wanted to be the head of the church, but he wanted the money. Yeah.
Okay, I thought that was an important point.
It's very important. We look in the history of the church, and even the Episcopal Church, we look to the Church of England, we look to Henry, as sort of the where it originated, but he was not a nice guy at all. Particularly evidenced by the fact he had 6 wives and killed some of them. Yeah. So thank you, Bud. That's interesting.
But it seems, on the other hand, that theologically Elizabeth got it.
Yes.
She understood what you.
Yeah.
She understood.
Yeah.
But she certainly understood the power and wealth side of it too.
Yeah, and moving forward from Elizabeth, I didn't say this, when James becomes king, James came from Scotland, and the predominant church in Scotland was the Presbyterian church. So when James becomes king, there were a lot of those outside the Church of England in England who thought, well, this is our way to bring the Protestant church in and not have the Church of England, not have Rome, but we can make the Presbyterian church more or less the main Church of England. They thought James would do that. And James' famous comment was, no bishop, no king. Because the monarchy and the bishop were tied hand in hand. And it still is that way in England. So the monarch names the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Archbishop of Canterbury crowns the monarch. That's still the way it is today. And James liked that. And he said, no, we will keep the Church of England, because he wanted that connection to remain. And of course, historically, one of the things Henry gave us, or gave to the church, was the Great Bible of 1539, which was one of the first Bibles in English, and that was used, for centuries. And then James comes along, and in 1601 decides that we need to do a new translation of the Bible into English, or the authorized version. And in 1611 we get the authorized version, which we now know as the King James Version. So the English Bibles that most of the English-speaking world has used since 1539 have been complements of the Church of England, which I love telling people when they say the King James Version is the only version of the Bible you can read, and I'll say, well, without the Church of England, you wouldn't have the King James Bible. Little tidbit. So now we come to colonization of America. And it has been documented, one of the first ships to settle in this country was Jamestown, Virginia, and that I can't recall the captain of the ship's name. The first thing he did when he landed was took a book of common prayer and prayed to God in thanksgiving for landing in this new space. And you get a pretty big division in the colonies. Virginia and South, the Church of England was pretty prominent, and north of Virginia in the New England area, it was the Mayflower. It was the Puritans who were fleeing the Church of England. They didn't like the established church, and so they wanted to come to this new land to have religious freedoms and to be out from underneath that. And so the Church of England did not fare well in the New England colonies, but did fare well in the South, particularly Virginia, of course, which we still call the mother. The Diocese of Virginia is still known as the mother diocese of the Episcopal Church. Georgia was a large Church of England place. South Carolina was too. And then we have the Revolution, and suddenly clergy were all in danger because you had to pledge allegiance to the king. That's part of what was in the 39 Articles. And when you were ordained to the priesthood, you had to sign a document saying that you would comply with the 39 Articles, and one of them was allegiance to the king. And so it put them in a hard place. What were they to do? That they couldn't pray for the king in church. Yet if they didn't pray for the king, then they were going against their ordination vows. So it put them in a really hard predicament. And as our curriculum says, a lot of them fled back to England or to Canada, where England still had control. So then we have the war's over. Priests begin to come back. We can't be the Church of England anymore because we're independent. So what do? Well, we don't want to change anything we've already done, but we've got to create a new way forward here in these colonies. And so we have in 1789 the formation of what was then called the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. And of course, Protestant just meaning not Roman Catholic, right? Even though they looked very Roman Catholic in the way they did things, they wanted to be very clear: we're not Roman Catholic. So 1789. But the interesting thing is, that happens in Philadelphia. There was a little something else going on in Philadelphia in 1789. Anyone remember what that is? I hear it. Someone's saying it.
Constitutional Congress?
Yes. Yeah, the Constitutional Congress. So. And we had many of the same people, and I'll say it, men, because they were men. Many of the same men served in both of those capacities. So they literally would be in one meeting here to work on the Constitution, and they would get up, they'd walk over to this church here and work on the articles for the Episcopal Church of the United States of America. So I like to say, if ever there was an argument for a national church, we would have a good argument, since we were part of the establishment of the Constitution and the governance of this country. But we didn't want an established church, so that never happened. But what did happen is we formed a bicameral form of government. The church formed a bicameral form of government. In the U.S. government, you have the House of Representatives and you have the Senate, one smaller than the other. In the church, you have the House of Bishops and the House of Deputies, one smaller than the other. So the House of Bishops kind of corresponds with the Senate, and the House of Deputies corresponds with the House of Representatives. So you have the form of government set up in exactly the same way, mostly because it was the same people doing it. And then, of course, we build the National Cathedral, which when I was in seminary, the dean said the greatest act of hubris we ever did to claim that we have the National Cathedral. Well, even though we were not the largest denomination by far in this country, are not the largest denomination, but we still have it, and it is a great place. But that's in 1789. You read in the material, we did not have bishops here. So for over 200 years, there was not an American bishop. And what does that mean? Well, that means you can't ordain clergy. You can't ordain other bishops. You can't do any of that. So they'd have to wait for a bishop to come over from England, or they'd have to go to England in order to be ordained. And there was a sticky situation because England didn't really want to do that because we had left them. So the great people of Connecticut elected a man, Samuel Seabury, to become a bishop, and they sent him to England, and England said, nope, you're not going to pledge allegiance to us, we're not going to do it. And then thank goodness for the Scottish Episcopal Church, because they stood up and said, oh, we'll do it, come up here. So he did. So he goes up to Aberdeen, Scotland, and they ordain him a bishop, and he comes back to the United States. And then consequently, we had William White was ordained bishop next. He was from Pennsylvania, and I don't remember who the third one was. But now that we had 3 bishops in the American church, we could then ordain other bishops. And thus the American line of succession began. So we talk about apostolic succession and going back to Christ and the apostles, and Christ laying hands on the apostles, and the apostles laying hands, and so on and so on and so on, until you get to your most current bishop who has had hands laid on as well. You see that apostolic succession in the Roman Catholic Church, you see it in the Eastern Orthodox Church, you see it in the Episcopal Church, and now you're seeing it again in the Lutheran Church. It had stopped for a while, but then it has come back. And what I like to tell people is, do we honestly believe that that line has never been broken since Jesus? And the answer is, yeah, it probably has been broken at some point or another. There's probably been something that happened. But, you know, the important part is we're trying to still be in that tradition of doing it in the same way. And so the historic episcopate means that we have bishops that still fall under that line of succession. If you look at the Roman Catholic Church, you know, there's asterisks all over the place when you have the papacy in both Rome and Avignon. You know, who counts, who doesn't count? Are they in succession and not? So there have been arguments everywhere, and England would say, no, we don't count in succession because you weren't consecrated by English clergy. And we say, no, but Scotland was in that succession. So there are going to be arguments about it. The point is, we continue that tradition, and we have bishops that still govern in the church. That's what we need to remember, and not worry about the minutia. Any thoughts or questions there?
Question.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so in England, from starting whenever, that the Archbishop of Canterbury has been kind of the head honcho. And when did the Protestant Episcopal Church start having a presiding bishop? Was that from the very beginning?
That was, it wasn't from day one, but it was in those very first few years. They decided that, yes, we would have a presiding bishop. And I think William White was actually the first presiding bishop. Yeah, Curtis?
Until the 20th century, the presiding bishop was the senior bishop by consecration who presided over the House of Bishops. There was no
Election,
formal
yeah.
presiding bishop that was elected. And it was sometime in the 20th century, I can't remember exactly when there started to be an election for a presiding bishop whose election was then confirmed by the House of Deputies. But it was not that way for hundreds of years, over 100 years anyway.
Yeah, and in those early years, the presiding bishop was also, the bishop of a diocese.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And then later they decided, no, we need to make it a separate deal because that's too much for one person. And it didn't used to have a set number of years that you served. And then they realized that it was wearing people out, so they set a term limit on it of 12 years. And then they decided that was too much, and so it's now 9 years. You're elected and you serve for 9 years, which allows you to preside over 3 general conventions. And general convention is our governing body when the House of Bishops and the House of Deputies come together, and that's where legislation is done every 3 years.
Well, I think tonight I just had a little epiphany because I knew about our American government and our Episcopal Church bicameral, but I'd never thought it's in the same terms of, and then that the president is president, but the president has one vote, and the presiding bishop is the presiding bishop and only has one vote. We don't have a king, we don't have a pope.
Right. Right. And when we came up with that form of government, we even went one step farther, and the metropolitan or the head bishop of a church within the Anglican Communion typically has the title Archbishop. And because we were trying to get away from England and the monarchy and all that kind of stuff, we refused to use that name. We didn't want the name Archbishop. And so we went with presiding bishop because he was the bishop who would preside over the General Convention. So that causes confusion too, but because in other parts of the Anglican world, their primate is the Archbishop, but we don't use that terminology. But
We have
the same power.
archdeacons.
What's that?
We have archdeacons, though.
We do have archdeacons, yes, and archdeacons think very highly of themselves. No, I'm just being funny. And archdeacons aren't all necessarily deacons either. You can have a priest as an archdeacon, which doesn't make any sense, but.
What is an archdeacon?
Archdeacon is a position within a diocese that is over the deacons. It's sort of the head of the deacons. I mean, the bishop is the head of the deacons, but you can have an archdeacon who sort of is the sergeant, kind of trains them and makes sure they're doing what they're supposed to do and keeps up with them and does all that kind of stuff. And if you're an archbishop, you get the title venerable, the venerable so-and-so.
Is there like a chart that shows that like hierarchy and explains what each position is?
I'm sure there is one. I don't know that I've seen it, but I can try to find it. It has all the terminology and all the who does what where, and then of course you get into the monastic world and it's all, you've got it there too. So
yes, that'd be great because it's really confusing to me.
To all the different titles and things we say.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll look for that. One of the neat things is there's a book, we'll call it the Red Book, that talks about the Episcopal Church. And usually if we were in a class setting, I would bring it out and show it to you. We have them at the Cathedral. I don't have one at home. And it gives you a breakdown of the Episcopal Church and the provinces. So we have, is it now 10 provinces?
Still only 9.
Still only 9.
It's 9.
There was talk of a 10th. So we have 9 provinces, which is a geographical breakdown of the whole Episcopal Church. And we call it the Episcopal Church of the United States of America, but we have members of the Episcopal Church outside of the United States of America. And that's something that not everybody realizes. So the Episcopal Church in Taiwan is part of the Episcopal Church USA. Colombia in South America is part of the Episcopal Church USA. Littoral and something else of Ecuador is part of the Episcopal Church USA. I can't think of all of them.
Recently.
Cuba
Last
most
General
recently.
Convention,
Yeah.
Cuba was readmitted back into the Episcopal Church. So
And then we also have what we call the Convocation of Episcopal Churches in Europe. And I think there's 9 or 10 of those, and one of them's in Rome. St. Paul's Within the Walls is a member of the Episcopal Church of the United States of America in Rome. The American Cathedral in Paris is part of the Episcopal Church USA. So we have extra provincial dioceses and places. We in the Diocese of West Missouri are in Province 7.
yes.
Of the church. So it's neat because that map lays out all the different dioceses and then the provinces. And then it also has a listing of the American succession of bishops. And what's really neat, as I said, it takes 3 bishops to ordain another bishop. You have the chief consecrator, and then you have the co-consecrators. And so the bishops are assigned a number based on their ordination. So Samuel Seabury, being the first bishop, is number 1. And then William White number 2, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're up to like 1,100s, I think, is where we are currently. But so you'll see the number of that bishop, and then next to it you'll see 3 numbers, and it'll be the numbers of the 3 bishops that consecrated that bishop. And so it's a neat historical chart to sort of look at and see who was part of that ordination all the way back to Seabury in 1787. So that's updated annually in this book. And then the book has every diocese listed and every parish and mission and everything within the diocese and how many members and who's there and all that. So it serves as a directory as well.
Is there ever any discussion, just looking at the number of dioceses on a map, for a relatively small church, it seems like a pretty heavy overhead.
Yeah, I want to say we have something like 102 dioceses.
100 domestic, 110 overall, including the overseas, is what's
Right.
in my head, but that number may be a little off.
Yeah,
I'm
so
pretty
that's
sure about the
right.
100 domestic. And the answer to your question is yes, there has been talk about that at successive general conventions, and there's a procedure for splitting and rejoining. So that is a conversation that has been going on at least the last, well, longer than this, but real seriously, maybe the last 10 or so years, there's been a good deal of discussion about that.
Another
General
question,
convention.
how are the deputies selected?
They are elected at diocesan conventions.
Okay.
And that's usually announced. So we have the next general convention is in 2021. So I'm guessing last year at this last diocesan convention, they were probably elected.
Secretary of the diocese will say yes, they were.
Yeah.
That's
So-
and I was one of the ones elected from the lay order. So
Oh, good. So what you do, Jim, is you announce that at this diocesan convention, we will be electing our deputies to general convention. And you elect 4 in the clergy order and 4 in the lay order. And the clergy order can be priest or deacon, and then the lay is lay. So every diocese is equally represented with 8 deputies. And then you elect alternates as well. Usually a first alternate and a second alternate. And then that's who goes to General Convention. So you have to be named from your own parish as as someone to go to Diocesan Convention, as being a delegate to Diocesan Convention, and then that group votes for who becomes the deputies for General Convention.
And that's not true in this diocese. I'm sorry to interrupt. That's not true in this diocese. You don't have to be a convention delegate to be a General Convention deputy. It may be true in other dioceses. It's not true in this one.
No, you have to. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you have to be a convention delegate to elect the deputies.
Oh, I misunderstood. My apologies.
Yeah. And every diocese can do it slightly differently, which is funny. I don't know yet how this diocese does it, but I can tell you in Alabama, the way they did it was the diocese was split into 3 areas. The northern, well, we jokingly always called it kingdoms. The northern kingdom, the middle kingdom, and the southern kingdom. It's the northern district, the middle district, and the southern district. So the way they would elect deputies for Diocesan Convention is that 1 clergy and 1 lay were specifically elected out of each of those districts. And then the 4th was at large and could be from anywhere.
And our diocese is strictly at large.
Yeah. And each diocese is allowed to set that up the way they want to do that. And you know, what's hard with that, and I don't know how it works in this, what the politics are yet in this diocese, but in Alabama, so the northern district, the Diocese of Alabama went from the northern border of the state down to Montgomery. Used to be the whole state, just like Missouri used to be the whole state. And then it divided in the 70s, and the southern part of Alabama became part of the central Gulf Coast. So from the northern border down to Montgomery, and then the borders east and west is the diocese. So big city-wise, your northern district, Huntsville was your largest city. The middle district, it was Birmingham, and in the southern district, it was Montgomery. And they were fearful if you did it at large, you would only get people from Birmingham and maybe Montgomery. So they did it by district to make sure you got some equal representation throughout the diocese. So that's how that works. And then bishops are automatically in the House of Bishops. So, but there was some controversy for a while as to whether or not they would let all bishops vote. I think they still do. I think retired bishops still have a vote, but there was talk of removing that.
That's true. There was. It has not happened yet. It keeps. I think something like that has been talked about the last 2 general conventions, but it has. Understandably not made it through the House of Bishops. I don't know why that might be.
Yeah, well, some of those retired bishops don't even, would be happy not to even go anymore.
There was a huge upswing in 2012 when we elected a presiding bishop of retired bishops who actually attended. Yeah, again, I can't imagine why that would be.
And with the presiding bishop, Curtis, correct me if I'm wrong, the bishops vote to elect the presiding bishop, and then the House of Deputies doesn't vote, but they have to ratify it.
That's correct, yeah. Okay. It's a majority in the House of Bishops, and then a majority of the House of Deputies confirms the election.
Confirms the election.
On a straight up or down vote, we vote on whoever they put forward.
Right, and not by orders. It's just overall. Right?
Vote.
Yeah.
Right.
So my question is there a book of governance? We have a book of common prayer, but is there a book of governance for the Episcopal Church that, for instance, lays out some of what you're talking about?
Yeah, the canons and constitutions of the church, the canons of the church lay that out. Yeah. Yeah, and
the canons being people, the canons.
No, the canons being the written rules of the church. There's a book called the Canons and Constitution of the Episcopal Church of the United States of America.
That's the church polity or church governance.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that has all those rules in it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's subdivided into sections and titles and blah 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 blah. It has all those rules in it, right? So one thing we have to do when we are ordained is we have to sign a document that says we will, follow the canons and constitutions of the church, or we could be stripped of our orders. So that's well within the rules of that. And then when I was installed here, part of that installation is that you are given a copy of the canons and constitutions and said that you will abide by them. Yes, Jesus, I will abide by them. And then normally you follow regular, like Robert's Rules of Order for Parliamentary Procedure. Yeah. Which all vestries are supposed to follow as well. Any other thoughts or questions at this time? One of the things that the reading brought up about the spread of the church, talked about how some of the other Protestant denominations, such as the Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church, grew more than the Episcopal Church because they had circuit riders and they were willing to expand out west and do that, where we were sort of set in our ways and didn't want to do that. And it did hurt the growth of the church for sure, until you had some of these what we called missionary bishops who sort of went out and started a diocese somewhere and then would hand it off and go off to start another one. Philander Chase was one of those bishops. Jackson Kemper was one of those bishops. It mentioned him by name. Who started? Kemper started Missouri. And then could go on and do other things. I think Philander Chase started Ohio and Illinois even, maybe. And what you find is as a bishop, as the church grows within a diocese and a bishop becomes somewhat overwhelmed with being able to care for the number of parishes in that diocese, that's when you tend, they might bring in another bishop, a second bishop, an assisting bishop to help. Or that's when you might see dioceses split and form another diocese because of the population. So certainly that was the case here from the Diocese of Missouri. Then it split into two dioceses and you got West Missouri. In Illinois, you had the Diocese of Illinois, which then split into three dioceses, became the Diocese of Chicago, the Diocese of Springfield, the Diocese of Quincy. But sometimes you see it go back the other way. So within the last 10 years, the Diocese of Quincy in Illinois actually went back and joined the Diocese of Chicago because they had a lot of smaller struggling parishes and were losing people. And it didn't become affordable to continue to run the diocese as it was. So they merged in with the Diocese of Chicago. So you see that happen too sometimes. And then you'll find dioceses that are still one entire state, like the Diocese of Colorado or the Diocese of Nevada, but don't necessarily have a large number of parishes. They're just spread out across the whole state. In fact, the former presiding bishop, Catherine Jefferts Shorey, remember, was the bishop of Nevada when she was elected presiding bishop. And she's a pilot. And she used to fly her plane around the diocese when she would make diocesan visits. That was just because Nevada's a pretty large state. And it was easier for her to fly from town to town than to drive out to all these other places. I thought that was kind of cool. Jeff, you said you found something that has all the terminology in it? Glossary in the Episcopal Church. Oh, good.
Yeah, it's a glossary on episcopalchurch.org. And even though Letitia was asking about all those suffragan bishops and archdeacons and all those positions, it's not in some sort of hierarchical structure, but if you're ever curious about about all the different words and terms that are used, I find it particularly confusing. Curtis doesn't, but I find it particularly confusing because I don't ever remember what we use at the altar the names for all of the little dishes and cloths and boards and such that have official
It's the
names.
tablecloth, the napkin, the plate, and the cup. I keep telling you that, Tim.
I know you dumbed it down as much as you can for me, Curtis, and I
Yep.
still
Yeah, but then you tell us to go get those things by a whole other name, Curtis.
You went to St. Olaf. You should know all that stuff.
I only know the Lutheran stuff. I don't. I know the Diet of Worms and the Oxford
Yes, same
Confession.
stuff.
I know all of that.
Well,
Well,
I expect more out of you, so you know.
And growing up
Here.
Catholic, I wasn't actually allowed to touch anything because I
That's
was
true.
a girl back then. Yeah,
Aren't you still?
I am, but the girls weren't allowed on the altar when I was a kid.
I know. It just sounded like you weren't a girl anymore.
Yeah, I realized that. It just came out wrong.
I also saw, of course, that the Canons are on episcopalchurch.org as well. So
Yep.
that's a great resource for all sorts of things.
If you have trouble falling asleep some night, open the Canons and start reading. That'll help immensely.
So I have a side comment about your bishop that flew around her diocese. Having done that as a salesman, I can tell you it was a good excuse to have an airplane.
Yeah, there you go. I will say just quickly in our last couple minutes here, you brought up, Jeff, titles and terminology, and you mentioned Bishop Suffragan. So we have basically four types of bishops in the Episcopal Church. You have the Bishop Diocesan, who is the head bishop of the diocese. You have and is elected to that position. You have a Bishop Suffragan, who is an assistant bishop that is elected by the diocese, and the election is called for by the diocesan. You have an assistant bishop, which is a bishop who's already a bishop that is appointed by the diocesan to come be an assistant in that diocese. So a suffragan and an assistant basically do the same thing. It's just the manner in which they were called. And then you have a bishop coadjutor who is elected in a diocese specifically to become the diocesan bishop once the diocesan steps down.
I like to call them bishops in waiting.
Yeah, right. But a suffragan or an assistant does not ascend to become the diocesan. Only a coadjutor can do that.
Can they if they get elected?
If they get elected, yes.